May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was a boy, I loved to play pirates, just like my son Titus likes to play. I would dress up in an eye patch and a three-corner hat. I would have in my hands a spyglass and a Jolly Roger flag. And in my teeth was a plastic cutlass. But most of all, I had a treasure in desperate need of burying. It was some old shoebox I'd colored to look like a treasure chest. It was filled with bottle caps and Chuck E. Cheese tokens and baseball cards, but to me, it might as well have been Spanish doubloons. And if I had a friend over, he and I would be shipmates. And the question would always come up, where do we hide the treasure? Now, we knew we couldn't deposit it in the bank. After all, at that time, the time of pirates, there was no Truist or Wells Fargo. We couldn't bury it in our backyard. The fresh mound of dirt might give it away. The only choice we had was to leave it in somebody's hands. But who? How about the school principal, my friend might ask? Nah, he might try to keep it for himself. How about your pastor at church? No, he'd put it in the collection plate. How about Mr. Cooper, your neighbor? He might try to split it 50-50. And on it went because the stakes were so high. It was my treasure, and I didn't want to leave it with just anybody. Now, that is one way to read today's Holy Gospel, like a divine game of where to leave the treasure. Because in it, it's as if God is searching for a safe place to leave His treasure. A treasure not of gold, but the gospel. Not of silver, but of good news. Not a treasure that's cold, hard cash, but the solemn promise that no matter what, our Emmanuel, God with us, is with us no matter what. That is the treasure. That is God at work in our lives and our world to set things right. That is the treasure. That a day is coming when swords will be beaten into plowshares and peace will flow like a river. That is the treasure. That despite any evidence to the contrary, a time is coming when justice will roll down like the waters. And empty barns and empty stomachs and empty hearts will be filled with grain and honey and joy and peace. That is the treasure. Now, where in the world do you leave a treasure like that? Because just like any treasure, God's treasure can be squandered. It can be ignored. It can be wasted. It can be idealized. And in this case, it can even be crucified. Where do you hide a treasure like that? A place where you can be sure it will be cherished and preserved and nourished. Well, that's what Luke wants to tell us in the gospel this morning. In fact, Luke tells us the surprising story of where God did decide to leave the treasure. Luke begins his story this way. In the days when Herod, king of Judah, as if to wink at us and say, now there's a possibility. God could have left the treasure with Herod, the politician, the mover, the shaker, the power broker. God could have left the treasure with the politicians, the ones who pave the roads and collect the taxes, the ones who build the buildings and pass the laws, the ones who command armies and oversee their citizens. God could have left the treasure with the politicians, which is not as strange an idea as it might sound. Because after all, the treasure is, at least in part, politics. When you heard the Magnificat just a few moments ago, did you catch all the political slogans? That God would pull down the mighty from their thrones and lift up those who have never tasted sweet justice. That is politics. Did you recognize the politics when God said that He would take those whose bowls have been empty and fill them with rice and grain, while those who have been looking out for number one will be sent away empty? That is politics. Every valley will be exalted, every hill will be made low. That's not real estate, folks. That is politics. And since it is politics, it might have made sense for God to leave the treasure with the politicians. But Luke's gospel makes it clear that God did not leave the treasure with Herod. Because Luke knows that if there is to be real peace, there can only be one sovereign. That if there's to be real justice, there can be only one ruler. If there is to be real goodness and joy shared by all, there can only be one king. And his name is not Herod. Every Christmas, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, at the base of the great Christmas tree, there is constructed a beautiful 18th century Neapolitan nativity scene. Now, in many ways, it is a very familiar scene. All the usual characters are there: the shepherds and their sheep, the wise men and their camels, and of course the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus. Each one is exquisitely crafted out of wood and clay and paint. They are all there, just as you might expect. And yet there is something very surprising and unexpected about this particular nativity scene. And to the casual observer, it might be easy to miss. But what is so strange about this scene is that the manger is not set, as we might imagine, among a first century little town of Bethlehem. But rather, the scene is set among the ruins of a Roman building. There, laying all around the manger, are the broken and fallen columns of some Roman temple or public building. The artist, you see, understood something about the treasure. They knew that the birth of this new world would have to mean the death of the old. That the birth of this king would be the death of all kingdoms. Just like Herod knew that if he were to survive, the treasure would have to be crushed. Luke makes it clear that God did not leave the treasure with Herod. So Luke continues his story. In the days Herod was king of Judah, there was a priest whose name was Zechariah. And Luke winks at us again and says, now there's another possibility. God could have left the treasure with the Zechariahs of the world, the people who think holy thoughts and who handle holy things and who perform holy deeds. Because after all, Zechariah is a priest, and a priest is a theologian. And the treasure is, well, at its heart, theological. Because the treasure is the good news that it is God who is with us, setting things right. It is God who gathers together the labor of our hands and gives them strength beyond our own measure. It is God who takes our best efforts and gives them hope beyond our wildest dreams. It is God who has made us. It is God who is with us. It is God who reclaims us. And that is the treasure. And it would make sense, wouldn't it, to leave it with the Zechariahs. Those people who think holy thoughts and handle holy things and who perform all kinds of holy deeds. And in fact, there is a hint in the Gospel of Luke that God even toyed around with the idea of leaving the treasure with Zechariah. You see, Zechariah was an ordinary priest who had an extraordinary problem. He did what ordinary priests did. He burned incense and offered sacrifices, and he had married Elizabeth, who was the daughter of an ordinary priest. And yet, what was extraordinary about Zechariah was that Elizabeth and he could have no children. She was barren, and they were both too old. And it brought them both great pain. To Elizabeth, it was a shame and embarrassment. And for Zechariah, it was the cause of much prayer. But one day, when Zechariah was in the temple, thinking holy thoughts and handling holy things and performing holy deeds, the holy intruded into his life. The angel said, "Zechariah, have great joy. Your prayers have been answered. You and Elizabeth will have a son." And in that moment, Zechariah showed his cards that he was not the place to leave the treasure. Because the man who had thought holy thoughts and handled holy things and performed holy deeds had become so numb in the process to the holy that when the holy actually intruded into his life, he just could not believe it. Why? How can this be? I'm old. My wife is barren. This cannot be true. I need proof. And in a scene of great sadness, the angel reached out and touched his lips. Silence! You will not be allowed to speak until these things have come to pass. Zechariah was not the place to leave the treasure. When it comes to religion, there can be a routineness and an over-familiarity that numbs us to the very holy when it comes intruding into our lives. The author and essayist Annie Dillard writes about how that can happen to us even in a worship service, much like the one we are participating in right now. She writes in her book, Holy the Firm, "The higher Christian churches, where if anything I belong, come at God with an air of professionalism, with authority and pomp, as if they knew what they were doing, as though people in themselves were an appropriate set of creatures to have dealings with God. I often think about the set pieces of the liturgy as certain words which certain people have addressed to God without getting killed. In the high churches, they saunter through the liturgy like Mohawks along a strand of scaffolding who have long forgotten their sense of danger. If God were to blast such a service to bits, the congregation would be genuinely shocked. But in the low churches, you expect it any minute. This is the beginning of wisdom. God needed some place so weak that the presence of the treasure would come as a welcome sign of good news, not as a threat like it did Herod. God needed some place so helpless that the news of the treasure would come not as good news too good to be believed, like Zechariah, but news so good there could be nothing else but to believe. And it is then that Luke tells us the surprising place where God left the treasure. In the womb of a young virgin, a place that the world would consider of least importance. And the first place that in the Gospel of Luke where the treasure is proclaimed to the world is neither in a pulpit nor the Roman Senate. It is in the conversation between two pregnant women about the life of God that is growing within them. In a conversation about stretch marks and swollen ankles, the good news is first proclaimed. In a place of weakness and of helplessness and of vulnerability. And for that, we can give thanks. Because it is where God chooses to leave His treasure, that He just might choose to leave it in other places just as weak and just as helpless and just as vulnerable. I'm sure many of you know about Stepping Stone Mission by now. Pastor Joseph Song heads up a Lutheran mission to the homeless right here in Atlanta. And oftentimes they will do a big feeding at one of the city's parks. And every year our church participates in one of those events. Jason, in fact, helps to set it up. Now, for whatever reason, I was unable to attend any of the first ones that happened. But a couple years ago, I finally made it, taking my oldest two, Eden and Jude, with me. And before the event, we helped to get it set up, and then we waited a few minutes for everything to finally begin. But let me tell you, there was nothing that could have prepared me for what walked up that day. Incoherent mumbling, eyes glazed over in hopelessness and despair. And you could see the blisters on their feet through the cracks in their shoes. Now, as a theologian, I am very ashamed to tell you what went on in my head that day. I thought, these people aren't interested in hearing about God. They have too many other problems. But as the hour wore on, I glanced over to my right, and there was Pastor Song taking each one of them aside. And as he shared the gospel and gave them a cross, I was surprised to find a smile break out on many a face. I looked to my left, and Brian Beckman was there, caught up in a boisterous conversation with a couple men about how God was at work in their lives. Then I turned my attention straight ahead. A group of volunteers was wrapping their arms around a man in need. They were deep in prayer, heads bowed, eyes closed. All around me, God was out there in the world. And even a theologian like me is starting to catch on. I think I'm learning where God decided to leave the treasure. Amen.